All right. So welcome back, everyone. We're gonna start. We are delighted to welcome Eric Fish to the Paulson Institute and the University of Chicago for a talk on China's millennials. And since I'm not millennial myself, I feel a little awkward introducing you, but I'm looking to see how many people look millennial in the audience. Anyway, we're excited on two counts. One, actually, Eric, we don't know you that. I just met you up in Canada at a conference not so long ago, but we know you by reputation. Dolly was commenting, he knows you from Twitter. You're a famous Twitter guy, but also because Eric has really staked out some interesting ground as kind of one of the best commentators of your generation on China. You were in Beijing for a while as a kind of freelancer, writing for The Atlantic, for foreign policy, for other publications, and now is back at the Asia Society, where he's like a media and content developer there. As important, I'm excited about this because of the topic, which is China's millennials. And Eric's written a book on that. It's an interesting topic, I think, for a few reasons. One, if you study Chinese history, people often talk about generations being something that matters. We hear about the May 4th generation in the early part of the last century, or we hear about the Cultural Revolution generation, the way in which for a whole generation of people in China, the experience of the 1960s and the early 1970s shaped their outlook, their worldview. Second, because this generation in China, this millennial generation, it's, I think, unique in a few ways. It's grown up in the context of a one-child policy, grown up really entirely in the era of economic reform at a time when China's richer and has a bigger role on the global stage than it's had before. But also, in a sense, because they could travel abroad. And you've had thousands and thousands of people, as we see in the audience, who are of a millennial generation in China, but who've had the experience of being abroad and who've brought some piece of that back to China. So there's a lot contextually that I think is unique about this generation. And then third, because at least for me, I mean, I read so many cliches about millennials in China. Sometimes you hear, oh, it's a very nationalistic generation. Politically motivated, but in a nationalistic direction. Then sometimes you hear the complete opposite. It's an apathetic generation. They care about money. They care about material things. They don't care about politics. Sometimes you hear, the little emperor syndrome. It's a one-child generation. They're a spoiled generation, and all cliches. There may or may not be truth to that, but there's a lot that's too simple and not true about that. So, Eric, you've literally written the book, at least in English, on this generation of people in China. So, we want to welcome you. And what we're going to do, this is very casual. So we'll have you come up and talk for 30, 40 minutes, and then do your own Q&A. And everybody's excited to hear you. And so, please join me in welcoming Eric to the University of Chicago. Eric Fish.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on this cold day. It's good to be in Chicago, even in February. Like Evan was saying, a lot of the things I was trying to do with this book, I have seen a lot of what is kind of a cliche at this point, that China is changing so rapidly, which it's cliche for a good reason. It is the truth. The problem with that is often things change faster than popular narratives can keep up with. And there are a couple of narratives that I noticed over the time I was in China that were very prevailing about young Chinese. And when I talk about Chinese millennials, the group I focused on were born between about 1984 and 1996, so mid-'80s to mid-'90s. Like Evan was saying, a lot of the stereotypes seem to be like this generation has been brought up very spoiled by the one-child policy, very coddled by the older generation. Other stereotypes that, again, they've become very nationalistic, very materialistic and focused on money. That's more of a foreign media narrative. And this really drove home in 2009 was the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. And a lot of reporters in Beijing at that time were kind of looking back at Tiananmen and saying, well, how come since that time there's not been any real sort of collective idealistic youth movement in China? And the answer basically that came back again and again was, again, going back to this narrative, well, youth today are too nationalistic to care about these domestic lofty political ideals, and at the same time, way too focused on money to care about anything lofty like that. And at that time, I kind of bought into that narrative that kind of seemed to fit to me in a kind of superficial way. But over the next couple of years, a lot of things were really changing quite quickly in China. Weibo took off around 2010, 11, and all of a sudden, all this information was spreading, people being exposed to things they'd never seen, never really appreciated. And by the time the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen rolled around in 2014, it kind of seemed like the media, by and large, dusted off this narrative. The one story, I think, even if people have no real interest in China, kind of the passing story around that time was things like reporters showing a picture of Tank Man to young Chinese, and they claim ignorance, at least, to not know what that is. But I thought that gave a very superficial kind of impression, and there's a lot going on that I think doesn't get covered quite as much. So to get into how I got into this topic in the first place, one of the first things that really sparked my interest was a story I did about 2010, 11. But this was actually one of the first things I noticed when I moved to China in 2007. I was living at a university in Nanjing. And if you're not familiar with this, basically at the beginning of every school year for universities, all incoming men and women alike, all incoming freshmen go through 2 to 3 weeks of military training called junshun in Chinese. And basically they have People's Liberation Army soldiers come to campus and they lead students in drills. They march back and forth, stand still. They have very strict rules on what you can wear. You're not supposed to have your hair past a certain length. Women aren't supposed to wear makeup or have painted fingernails. Guys aren't supposed to have facial hair. And there are all kinds of inspections. And if you step out of line, do something wrong, then you get punished with push-ups, running laps. There's also like patriotic lectures, sing a lot of patriotic songs, do team building exercises. And I was really kind of intrigued by this because it kind of begged the question. I mean, China already has the world's largest standing army. Do they really need this reserve of college students to have 2 to 3 weeks of military training? Looking a little deeper, there's not really a whole lot of practical military component to it. And when I looked into it, the Ministry of Education, the reasons that they set for this military training, is to, quote, temper students' willpower, and also build patriotism, collectivism, and revolutionary heroism. And I kind of thought that this was a very interesting relic. Now, this military training, it's been around for decades, but it wasn't really until 1989 that it was really expanded, formalized, became a very formal nationwide exercise that every university had to do and has certain guidelines on what has to be done. Of course, 1989, as I mentioned, the Tiananmen crackdown. And in fact, that year, students at Peking University, where a lot of the student instigators of the protest had come from, they had to do a full year of this military training. So it really, and when I talked to some military experts, both in China and the United States, about kind of what this sort of exercise is meant to instill. And it's kind of the same for militaries all over the world. By doing these repetitive marches, being punished for little deviations, you really train people to instinctively obey. So on the battlefield, it's important because if you tell your soldiers to go kill or get killed, you can't have them turn around and ask why, question the wisdom of your orders. And having the matching army fatigues, really stripping away the sense of individualism, really reinforces that. It enforces the idea that you are a cog in the machine. You're not an individual, you are part of the machine, and if you stick your neck out, if you do anything differently, the whole machine breaks down. So that comes to the collectivism part of the goal here. So a lot of this harkens back to, like I said, this came about after Tiananmen, really. And at that time, a couple days after Tiananmen, Deng Xiaoping addressed some generals that had been involved in the crackdown. And he said, our biggest mistake was in the field of education and not teaching young people about the need for hard struggle and what things were like in the olden days. And within a couple of years, that mindset became the official sort of government source of legitimacy. Throughout the 80s, even though China was reforming, becoming quite capitalist, it still relied on socialist ideology as sort of the source of legitimacy for the Communist Party. It stressed class struggle, proletarian internationalism, kind of like the workers of the world unite. And Tiananmen kind of showed this approach as bunk. So in line with Deng's sort of lamenting after Tiananmen, the national source of legitimacy really shifted to a victimhood narrative and really started emphasizing nationalism. And this century of humiliation narrative was brought into the fore, introduced in 1991, really took effect nationwide by 1994, really teaching that China was this incredible, exceptional civilization, and it was only brought to its knees when foreign aggressors took China down, from the Opium War through the Japanese invasion. And it wasn't until the Communist Party came, liberated China, set it back onto this path of national rejuvenation. And you hear Xi Jinping say this a lot now. So I really thought that the military training kind of represents all of these aspects and how the Communist Party is trying to keep a hold of the young generation. On one hand, trying to instill obedience, collectivism, and on the other hand, using these nationalistic kind of patriotic lessons, which have really lately, you see a lot of the rhetoric in China has really been intensified. But when I got a little bit deeper, I kind of wanted to know, well, how well is this working? And I started talking to students and looking online, and it's not working so hot in terms of stripping away individuality. These are some pictures that went around online. You can see all sorts of people break the taboo about having painted fingernails. People have all sorts of signals of expressing their individuality. This picture of two cadets making out, this was the subject of a national TV segment. You had some guys on CCTV kind of sitting around just lamenting like, oh, what's wrong with young people today? Become so open and westernized. And I interviewed a PLA lieutenant who had done the military, who'd conducted this military training a couple times. He said, yeah, kids today are just so crazy. When I give them orders, they ask why, so much more than my generation did. And it was funny hearing him say this because this lieutenant was 25 years old. And he was talking about 18, 19-year-old kids as a completely separate generation from him. So that really drove home how fast things were really changing and how, young people are quite rapidly expressing themselves and being much less obedient. And there are a couple big reasons for this, I think. The main thing, no secret, China's economic growth. Throughout the 80s, it started to take up. After Tiananmen, there was a little bit of a lull. Then Deng did his southern tour, and privatization of the economy really kicked off in earnest. The economy took off. 2001, China joined the WTO, and then it just exploded from there. So kind of the implication of this, I think, is the people who were born and who were coming of age among the economic growth, they still had memories of Mao, still had memories of Cultural Revolution. Even people who were brought of age in the 80s, I mean, that was pretty extreme hardship. And then they experienced this steadily growing quality of life. People were stable, they had enough to eat, they were rich in more and more situations. So I think that really contented a lot of people. But then you have a generation now that was born amid this. They were born amid this economic growth. A lot of people who are their teens and 20s now, they were born into relative comfort. So this economic growth is less and less impressive. And this was kind of the tacit bargain after Tiananmen, where the party basically said, okay, let us stay in charge, stay out of politics, and you can get rich. And I think that bargain has worked quite well for a long time. But now you have these people that are starting to challenge that and wanting more than pure economic growth. And the other implication of this is China used to have what were called these danwei work units, which were basically the lowest level of the government bureaucracy. And basically you were assigned your job, assigned your work unit, and you had to get permission from them for everything, basically, to travel, to get married. They even monitored women's menstruation cycles a lot of the time, make sure they weren't getting pregnant when they weren't supposed to. So very, very invasive. But when the private economy took off, these danwei state-owned units really collapsed, and people had more freedom than they've ever had. So now you have an older generation that was alive before this who kind of has this memory in the back of their mind of Big Brother standing over their shoulder. Young people today don't have that memory. They don't have any scars from the Cultural Revolution, so really grown up much freer in a lot of ways and less fearful of authority. You see this sort of rebelliousness. And then the other big thing, of course, information flow. 2000, almost nobody was on the internet. Today, more than half of China has internet access. And that's even more acute among young people. About 80% of teenagers are online. So in a lot of ways, this is letting people explore other opinions, countervailing ideas. So for instance, if I started feeling like I was homosexual 15 years ago, I would have thought I had a mental disorder, which in fact it was classified as such in China at that time. But now I can go online, see there's a lot of people like me, and I might explore whatever different interests I have. You extrapolate this out into China, I mean, you just see all sorts of youth cultures, subcultures, things that would have been incredibly taboo 10 years ago are now not only okay, but celebrated. You have tough guy football players, Hell's Angels wannabes, goths, people exploring different sexual identities. Religion is really taking off, especially among young people. Just exploring all kinds of different things. And I think this really speaks to how much individualism is sprouting among young people and having less fear of exploring this. And I think this is really interesting because in a lot of ways this challenges what the Communist Party, kind of what they've relied on for their sense of control. Like, this really flies in the face of the idea of military training, trying to make everybody conformists, collectivists, because when you are authoritarian leader, you kind of rely on conformity to some extent. You set the status quo and then you rely on peer pressure and fear to have everybody fall in line with that status quo. But all of a sudden when it's acceptable and even celebrated to do something different, to have opinions that challenge the status quo, that becomes challenging in a lot of ways for government leaders. And the stories I did in my book, I tried to talk to a lot of people in a lot of different fields across the country and see how this was playing out. And one of my favorite examples was when I was looking into entrepreneurship and people doing different things, doing startups and whatnot, because this is something that's really important for China right now. For so long, China has relied on sort of catch-up growth, taking the low-hanging fruit of a developing economy, cheap exports. But China's kind of exhausting that now and realizes it needs to become more innovative, climb up the value chain if it's going to keep growing economically. So a couple of years ago, this was really a concern when you saw a lot of talk about innovation on TV. And this picture is from Youth Day, May 4th in 2013. And she was really trying to drive home this message and was saying, well, it's young people that are the hope of being innovative. So he met all these kids, and this picture kind of struck me because all these kids are very clean cut, all have short, well-groomed hair. They had very impressive backgrounds, all top students that were like going into rocket science, medical science. And to kind of give his speech, I'm quoting from People's Daily right here, talking about this. Says, she delivered a speech Saturday urging the country's young to contribute to the realization of the Chinese dream. He urged the country's young people to be firm believers of the path, theories, and systems of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and to dedicate themselves to the cause of the nation's great rejuvenation. Only when you knit your personal dreams together with the great cause of the nation and build the platform of personal efforts on the basis of the country's cause can your personal dreams be realized. So who's inspired after hearing that? Yeah, I wasn't either. It was kind of funny because he was starting to use this Chinese dream, and on the surface it kind of seemed to be like the American dream, and where if you work hard you can live out your ambitions, but just couldn't resist bringing in this sort of source of emotional legitimacy for the Communist Party and tying it back to socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is kind of the euphemism today for authoritarian capitalism and of the communist one-party directed economic growth. But I thought this kind of goes back again, keep emphasizing, well, make sure your dream lines up with the national cause and the great national rejuvenation. And about this time, I talked to an entrepreneur that I found who had done a startup, and this guy was really interesting. He had started this music company that's kind of like Pandora, except it had a little twist. This guy had been a piano prodigy, and he also had a passion for computer coding. So he kind of combined the things, and he made a music service where you choose your mood, if you're happy, sad, depressed, and it would match music to whatever your mood was like. It was really a cool combination of his talents. And the company had gotten a lot of interest. It had millions of users by the time I talked to him. He had 30 employees working for him, had gotten quite a bit of investment. And it turns out that some state-owned television reporters had heard about him before I did. And around the time she had talked to these kids, they were doing segments on the Chinese dream and finding young people who were living out this idea of the Chinese dream. So they met this guy who's a clear contrast to the kids in Xi's photo op. He was a self-described hippie. And when the reporters showed up, they were interviewing him. And they said, so how did you do it? What inspired you to take this dive into being an entrepreneur? And he thought for a second, he said, I guess it kind of all goes back to when my parents got divorced. And the reporter kind of stopped and shifted tracks, and they said, okay, you must have worked really hard in school. Tell us about your studies. He said, actually, I fought with my teachers all the time. Like, I was a really bad student. And the reporter kind of shifted tracks, and he said by the time the reporter left, they basically said in so many words, well, your story doesn't quite fit with the theme of this Chinese Dream series. The segment never ran on TV. But when I talked to him, I was curious about like these things that they had kind of glossed over, and he said, like, his parents had been forced to marry very young in the early 80s, and then they had him, but they never got along. They got divorced, and they kind of passed him off to a series of relatives, and it was really painful. He was like 6, 7 years old when this was happening. So he said piano was my escape. Like, I just kind of escaped into piano, like threw all my energy into that, which got him into this line. And then he said, like, when he was in school, because his parents were divorced and he was being handed off, he really didn't get the same pressure that a lot of his classmates were getting. Like in China, in middle school, high school, it's all about the Gaokao, college entrance exam. Like, that's what your life revolves around, passing that exam. But he said because his parents like didn't really care, he didn't have that pressure. And in class, like, he wrote essays, and he said, the teacher, there's always one answer when teachers give you a writing assignment. And I didn't like to give that answer. I like to write crazy things. And I got low scores because of it, and I always fought with my teachers. And after like he was recounting the story of being denied being on TV, he was kind of he said, the hope of this nation is free thinkers, not just good students. The Chinese dream should be about many people pursuing their own dreams. And sort of, I think there's a lot of economic legitimization behind that, about having a pluralistic society. And a lot of the entrepreneurs I was talking to, young people, very few of them had this perfect path, studied hard, a good loving family, graduated a good college, then built something. No, there was always some kind of kink in that. Like, there had been some kind of taboo thing in their background that pushed them into this. And it really wasn't embraced in Xi's idea of the Chinese dream. And then I went on to ask him, like, who his idols were. And like many of the startup founders I was talking to, he cited Steve Jobs as his idol. And he said it's not only because of his success. He was a weird person according to society. He had personality problems. Most Chinese startups find him very inspiring. If you're not recognized by society now, don't give up. There is innovative and inspiring thinking happening here. We do have hippies in China. We want the outside world to know that we're trying to change the direction of this country. I thought that was really interesting because this really flies in the face of that stereotype of people being politically apathetic, not being pushers of change. And I kind of extrapolated this out because, I mean, what he's doing, his different mode of thinking, his different opinions, like, that's not incredibly threatening to the government to have an entrepreneur thinking outside the box. But there are all sorts of different iterations of this. Social activism is becoming bigger now. So these are some people I talked to. Some of you might remember this. About a year ago, there were 5 feminist activists that were arrested for more than a month for doing kind of these cheeky demonstrations. Like, this is when they were protesting domestic abuse by wearing blood-spattered bridal gowns. And then LGBT activists I talked to, this woman that tried to marry her girlfriend at the Beijing Marriage Bureau. So people doing, like, pushing for social progress. You see this in all sorts of different fields. People sticking their neck out to push for social progress at a pace that's faster than the government would like. And again, a lot of people were surprised that they arrested these young women for things that were very benign, seemingly, but just the act of pushing something that wasn't on the agenda was pretty threatening. Environmental protests have become really big. Before 2007, there had not been a single large-scale environmental protest involving more than 10,000 people. That year in Xiamen, there was a big protest over a chemical plant that was being built. It was mostly led by like high school, college students that had instigated it, and tens of thousands of people went out onto the street. Eventually, the plant got canceled. And over the following years, you saw lots of different examples in lots of different cities where you had these mass protests that were mostly youth-led, pushing against this thing. So again, this goes back being bolder, being less content with pure economic growth, fighting for more quality of life-oriented things like things against pollution. And then these were 2 harder core activists that I talked to. The woman on the left here, she started a campaign to free a human rights lawyer who had been detained. So she was a 21-year-old student, and she made these pictures of the guy saying, like, we were post-90s, we're rising, we support this lawyer, Pu Zhiqiang. And she got a bunch of her friends to go along with it. They uploaded pictures of themselves online, spread on Weibo. She got a couple dozen people in the end, which I thought was pretty bold. And then the guy on the right here, last year on the anniversary of Tiananmen, he wrote this really biting open letter to the government telling them to reevaluate the verdict on Tiananmen and basically calling the government fascist. And it was kind of the same thing. He started with about 10 of his friends, wrote this open letter. He was actually studying in the US at the time, but the letter went around in China. Hundreds of people signed it. Then Global Times was nice enough to decry it in an editorial, and then that got thousands more signatures after that. And I talked to both of them, and I mean, don't get me wrong here, these are very rare people. Like, these are by no means representative of young people in general. What they were doing was quite rare. But I talked to both of them, and I said, like, aren't you afraid? And like, do people avoid you? And they like basically said, like, yeah, but like, I got a lot of people. It wasn't too hard to get my friends involved with this. 5-10 years ago, my classmates would have avoided me. Their parents would have told them to avoid me at all costs. But now it's okay to be rebellious like this, and a lot of people actually think it's really cool. And they weren't just finding radicals on the other side of the country 1,000 miles away. They just got their friends to do it. And the younger people I talked to, it seemed like this was becoming more and more common. A girl that I talked to, a high school student from Shanghai a couple months ago, she said, actually the status quo now is being rebellious and like criticizing the man, the government. It's the people that really like support it that are seen as goofy. I don't know how apt that is, but just this fact though that people are willing to stick their necks out for these sort of lofty goals. And I thought the biggest representation of this was a couple years ago, 2013, there was these protests for this liberal Southern newspaper called Southern Weekend, when they'd written this editorial calling for constitutionalism. So it was a little bit critical of the government, but not really. But then the censor came in and made it just this puff piece glorifying the government. So the reporters were really miffed by it. They went on strike, and word leaked out, and thousands of people across the country were retweeting it on Weibo. And people were, mostly college students, were holding up these signs, Nanfang Jiao, like, let's go Southern Weekend, supporting the paper and using their faces, like having their faces shown when they did this. And even more remarkably, a couple hundred people showed up at the newspaper's offices and protested with signs. And I thought this picture on the lower right was really telling. Police were walking around at that protest, taking pictures of the protesters, kind of trying to intimidate them. And you can see from this young woman about how well that worked. A picture was worth 1,000 words in this case, I thought. And how people going to this, people uploading pictures themselves, they have everything to lose by doing this and very little to gain personally. And this is becoming, I think, more and more common, young people sticking their necks out for these lofty ideals, which I think is really interesting in a lot of ways. And this, most of the people I've been talking about here are like urban middle class, but I went down the kind of socioeconomic ladder to factory workers, and you can recognize this a lot there too. Over the last couple of years, factory protests have just been rising exponentially. If you look at the figures, almost every month, there's a steady uptick in the number of labor protests, strikes, things of that nature. And a lot of that's economic. China's economy's slowing down, which stresses factories. But I don't think you can discount the changing kind of mindset among these young factory workers. And I looked back at some literature from 20 years ago about factory workers in China. And it seemed at that time that basically most people migrated from their rural hometown to cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, work in these factories, make a bunch of money, then go back home after a couple years. And they were really kind of under the thumb of their bosses because they could keep their ID. If they had been on the street without their ID, they could be fined. If they didn't like the conditions, they were really in no position to speak out. They could be replaced very easily. They could be silenced very easily. Anyways, there was no real way to organize. So it seemed like that generation, up through the 90s of factory workers, people kind of kept their heads down. When I went to Shenzhen, I talked to a bunch of factory workers, and it was a completely different world, much higher ambitions. In fact, now if you look at the statistics, most migrant workers in factories now don't plan to go back to their rural hometown. They plan to stay there and kind of assimilate. This is becoming very interesting because China has this sort of dual hukou system where rural migrants don't have the same rights. Now you have all these rural migrants seeing their city counterparts that they don't have the same rights, and that's becoming a cause of angst for a lot of people. But then just the factory workers I was talked to, incredibly ambitious, a lot of them. One guy I talked to wanted to start his own factory. One guy I talked to, his goal was to learn English, immigrate to Canada or the United States and teach foreigners Chinese. So incredibly ambitious for a rural worker coming to work in a factory. And at the same time, not willing to put up with a lot of the things that their parents' generation had. One guy I talked to quit his job because his boss wouldn't install an air conditioner on the assembly line. And his parents had been factory workers, and he said, yeah, my parents said I was crazy when I quit that job, and I didn't even have another one lined up. So I think even when you go down, you kind of see this mindset of being much bolder about speaking out for more of a say in things. So that's part of the story. The other half of the story, with young people today, as I said, ambitions seem to be rising quite quickly. Expectations are rising, and at the same time, the socioeconomic realities are becoming quite a bit tougher in a lot of ways, and a lot of these expectations are going unmet. So I'm going to go through a couple of these issues really quick. We can revisit them in the Q&A if anybody has further interest, but some of them, so this is the rate of college graduates every year, which has been growing really steadily for the last about 15 years. And every June now you see almost the same story in Chinese media. 250,000 more college graduates than last year, but 10, 15, 20% fewer jobs waiting for them upon graduation than last year. So every year you have a bigger and bigger gap of unemployed, educated youth. And this is really disillusioning for a lot of people because basically their parents' generation, if you got into college, you were set. Like that could really open doors. 1978, 79, when colleges were first reopened, only about 5% of the people who took the college entrance exam got into a college. So those people had a bright future. Now about 75% get into some kind of college or university. And the jobs just aren't there for them when they graduate. So college degrees have been really devalued. And you see a lot of people really getting disillusioned by this. And this is getting exacerbated by a couple other things in China's economy. The wealth gap is getting bigger and bigger, it seems. So if you're not familiar with the Gini coefficient, I don't want to get too technical, but basically this is a measure of wealth inequality where 1 is where one person has all the wealth, 0, perfect equal distribution of wealth. And they generally say if you're at about 0.4 as a country, you're at risk of social instability. The United States is the blue line here, infamously bad wealth inequality, as we hear a lot about in the presidential election right now, past the 0.4. China even higher, even by the official government figures. The government said that wealth inequality in China peaked in 2008 at 0.48 and has been declining a little bit since then. But there have been some independent studies, and those find that wealth inequality is still getting bigger in China, and it's quite a bit higher than that, putting it anywhere between 0.5 and 0.62, I think was the highest estimate, which would make China one of the most unequal societies in the world. And a lot of the young people I talked to really kind of felt that, and I heard this refrain from a lot of people, like including factory workers, who I was kind of surprised to be this well-informed about economic factors. And a lot of them said, when China reformed in the 80s and 90s, even 2000s, there was all this low-hanging fruit. So if you were ambitious and smart, you could grab a piece of that fruit and make a name for yourself in the economy. Now you have all these idols, Robin Lee, Jack Ma, who've become tremendously rich on China's economic growth. But there seems to be a sense now among young people that they missed the boat. There was a limited number of seats on these opportunities, and that ship has sailed. So now the wealth is accumulating among a smaller and smaller group of elites, and they pass it down to their children, their connections, all these opportunities. And I heard this even at the most kind of menial blue-collar work. There were a couple rural guys from Henan who went to Jinan, the provincial capital of Shandong, and they said they couldn't even find like menial labor work. They said, oh, if you don't have connections in this city, it's hard to get like even a job at a grocery store. So seems to be the sense among a lot of people that the odds are stacked against them. And there was this cartoon that was really popular on Weibo a couple of years ago that really sort of drove this home about the way a lot of young people are feeling that if you're born into a wealthy background, it gives you such a head start in life, whereas if you're born to a poor rural family, that's really a drag on you. And this is another huge issue that's increasingly hitting young Chinese as this aging population, which has made, I mean, a lot of countries are experiencing this, but China is really one of the first to be a developing country still, but still have an aging population. That's largely because of the one-child policy. So you have a lot of young people now who are in this, they call the 4-2-1 situation, where you have one kid expected to take care of 2 parents, 4 grandparents. And that's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of young people. And in turn, a lot of young people are getting huge pressure from their parents to buckle down, get a good, stable job, make as much money as possible. And like I talked about earlier, this is clashing with a lot of the ambitions of young people. So like I said, they were brought up with kind of loftier expectations, much more ambitious. A lot of people don't want to do the job that's going to get them the most money. A lot of people want to go into meaningful things, environmentalism, social activism, things like this that don't necessarily bring a big paycheck. All kinds of resistance from their families in doing this, to get married, have a kid, which is also seen as sort of a social safety net. So this is hitting a lot of people. And then the last thing I'll mention is this really big wild card in China's future that's getting worse and worse every year, and that's this huge gender imbalance. So because of a combination of a traditional preference towards males, ultrasound, sex-selective abortion, China now has 20 million more men of marriage age, so between 20 and 49 years old, than it does women. And every year that gets worse by about 1 million men, and it's not supposed to peak out until like the 2040s, 50s, when you're gonna have 40, 50 some million more men than women. And this is, again, putting extra pressure on a lot of people, on both sides actually. A lot of men are becoming very desperate for wives, families very desperate to get them wives. But there's also issues for women on the other side. A lot of women don't want to get married so quickly. Like in any developing country, women are staying in school longer, becoming more and more ambitious in their careers, putting off marriage, not wanting to get married at all. And this is kind of making it even more of a challenge, this gender imbalance. And the reason that this is going to be a wild card, which kind of goes back to some of the things I've been saying, is when you have a situation like this, it is a recipe for volatility. And China had a situation like this in the 1800s, where you had a gender imbalance in some areas that was kind of brought on by famine, selective neglect of daughters, pooling resources around the boys. And that was one of China's most violent periods in history. You had all sorts of uprisings, Nian Rebellion, Taiping Rebellion, all these kind of things that came together when you have all these kind of restless men in society. So this is going to be an interesting dynamic if things go sour economically. So where I'm kind of going with all this, I don't at any point try to predict the future. I don't know where a lot of this is leading, but I do think you have these overarching trends where young people in general have brought on more lofty expectations about their future, becoming very ambitious, and on the other hand, the socio-political, socioeconomic reality is getting much more challenging in a lot of ways, and people are less scared now than they were in the past about raising their voice when things like this happen. So where does that lead to? Will there be another youth uprising like there was in 1989? Are some of these things more of a distracting force? Will they keep youth away from doing things like this? There is a lot of things going in different directions, a lot of contradictory signals. So I don't want to try to predict the future. There's a graveyard of analysts who've tried to do things, but I think that these are very interesting trends to keep an eye on. And I think a lot of these things, the younger people I talk to, the late post-90s now, it's going to become interesting when they come of age and start kind of taking control of China. So I've jabbered on long enough. I'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A. Anybody has?
There seems to be a crisis for Chinese government to understand their young generation, and also to put up like policy or communication strategies to try to involve them into the political system. But on the other hand, when President Xi came to power, he tended to have a stricter, a stronger grip on populist opinion. If you see the media, if you see policy-wise, everything's got centralized. And trying to promote the party, the legitimacy of party. So going forward, do you foresee a political crisis like other in the movement happen in Middle East or Europe? That can be same thing happening in China. And this is my first question. And my third question is some of your points you raised about racial, the gender gap and then the aging population. I see some, solution to those problems. For example, we have, bringing the women from other countries like Vietnam to fulfill the needs. And then also there are some more immigrants from Africa to China. Do you see the immigration will be a big issue going forward? So this is my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with importing women is, like I said, there's poised to be some 40 to 50 million extra men. So if you can think of a country that's going to send 50 million women over to China, I cannot think of one off the top of my head. And there's been people suggesting exporting China's men, like going to Africa, developing, but again, you're not going to export this many men. So, I mean, this is an issue China's going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future. How they can solve that, I have no idea, and there are no really easy fixes to it. And this is something that is unprecedented in human history. We have never, I mean, there are other countries that have gender imbalances, but none as high as China has right now. So it's just going to be an incredible dynamic that plans out. And what that looks like, I have no idea. Like I said, going back to your first question, like any kind of like Arab Spring kind of thing, and when you do have a lot of people without jobs, especially restless males, and throw on top of that males that don't have a wife. I mean, you look at, there's been all these studies done that single men commit more crimes than married men. A single man is 3 times more likely to murder than a married man. And there's been studies on China specifically that since the gender imbalance started, the crime rate has gone up. And like looking at individual cities and like seeing that there is a distinct correlation. So it's almost certain that there's going to be more social unrest because of that. Does that look like 19th century China where you had sort of these groups of restless guys coalesce into larger rebellious movements? It's a little bit harder to envision that, but I have no idea. Going back to your first question about like what the government's trying to do about this, like you're right, it seemed before Xi Jinping came to power, there was kind of a softer approach. Like there were movies that came out, like Founding of a Nation, Founding of a Party, which kind of tried to make the Communist Party look cool, appeal to young people that way, which kind of flopped. And I mean, there are way more practical ways. I think the party is trying to sort of co-opt the most ambitious, the most well-accomplished people, like Peking University graduates, Tsinghua graduates that are going to go on to do big things. Because if they don't co-opt them, then they're going to they could go and do something not on the government agenda. And this was something that kind of pushed back against a lot of this idealism. I talked to a professor at Tsinghua who was teaching like aspiring entrepreneurs. And he said it was kind of depressing because like looking at the most ambitious, accomplished people at Beida, he said broadly there's 2 groups among his students. There's one group that says, the system is kind of broken, there's a lot of big problems, so I'm going to become part of that system and get what I can from it. Then there was a group that said, I hate the system, so I'm going to get away from it. I'm going to immigrate abroad, take my talent elsewhere. What he said there was fleetingly few of were really well-accomplished, ambitious people that said, I'm going to change the system. I'm going to change the direction. So that kind of pushes back. But she is kind of taking a harder line approach. So yeah, I don't know what that's going to look like. A lot of these protests that I talked about, those have really died down because she is really trying to nip anything in the bud that could potentially sprout into something bigger. And there are worries that he's going to use nationalism to a greater degree, try to stoke anger against the US or Japan. But the danger with a strategy like that, again, looking at Chinese history, so many rebellious movements, Tiananmen included, started as nationalistic anti-foreign protests. The May 4th movement, there were movements in the 30s against Japan, and a lot of people don't realize Tiananmen actually had roots in 1985, 86, when there were protests against Japan for various issues, but people started raising signs like protest the Japanese, protest corrupt officials, and eventually that kind of evolved into wholly focusing on domestic leaders. So you're kind of playing with fire if you use that kind of hardline nationalistic approach. So I don't know, he seems to be going down a harder line road. If he realizes that's a mistake at some point, yet to be seen.
Thank you, Eric. Going back to the official, the question about the officialdom, could you say a little bit about the relevance, the significance of the Communist Youth League to some extent? And that's obviously the official institution that seeks to relate to the group that you're studying. And this particular group, the generation that you're talking about, born in the 1980s and 90s, they are actually getting married, having children, and of course, you title the subtitle your book as the Want Generation. There have been a lot of concerns, for example, about China's foreign exchange rate and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how, in fact, those kind of popular attitudes and their demands and desires may shape official policy? For example, in the through 2005, the Chinese currency was severely actually undervalued, and now, but the fact is, you raise the value of the Chinese currency, you also increase the purchasing power of people, your generation, right? That this generation you study. But of course, if this rate fluctuates and even gets devalued, it hurts them. And what does that mean? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the subtitle of my book, The Want Generation, kind of goes back to this, like I said, the younger people, more ambitious, higher expectations. But yeah, like if things go south economically, whether you're talking about currency, jobs, whatever, I think that is going to be a huge challenge because, like I said, this generation in general seems to want more than their parents had. And if the reality becomes worse than their parents had, I mean, it's not going to become worse in absolute terms, but compared to what they're expecting, I mean, that's going to be a huge, huge thing. And it's kind of similar to what you see in the U.S. now about millennials. There is a lot of overlap in this, in that, like, my generation in the U.S., we were brought up with very lofty expectations, thinking that if we get a college degree, things are going to be fine. Then the economic crisis happened. And it was very politically challenging, and I think, like, you kind of see that manifested now. There's a lot of popularity for Bernie Sanders and, like, young people looking to somebody who's going to, like, have their interests in mind. But I don't know what that looks like politically in China, whether that's going to become a disruptive political force. I mean, things probably aren't going to be as bad as they were in the 80s when you had like 20% inflation. But I mean, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen in that regard? And who knows how bad the economy is going to get and what kind of the threshold is before people get upset and demand more out of their leaders. And then your question about the Communist Youth League, I mean, it still seems that Communist Party membership among young people is more a pragmatic decision than anything. Like, I found one stat that only about 4% of, like, Chinese college students that are trying to join the Communist Party are doing so because of a genuine belief in the system. It's more about personal opportunities. But the Youth League, I mean, there, in general, with young people, there is more of a sense now. You hear new rhetoric almost every day about the need for strengthening education or ideological education, getting a better hold on the ideology of young people, because I think the government clearly sees that they are losing hold in a lot of ways, and keeping the legitimacy is going to be harder and harder, because that was sort of the post-Tiananmen Pact, is we'll give you economic growth as long as you stay out of politics. Now people are wanting more of a say in things. And this sort of ideological emphasis that she is trying to just bleed down to the lowest levels, I don't know how effective that's going to be. I think a lot of people are already very cynical of that. And I did a chapter on the political education in China's universities, and like almost everybody I talked to was cynical of it to some degree. I think there is a widespread appreciation of, like, this is kind of propaganda. Like, so I don't think enhancing that's going to do anything. It might have the opposite effect. It really highlights how much propaganda there is. So I think, like, organizations like Communist Youth League, education in general, if the order even does trickle down that far, which oftentimes it doesn't, the emperor makes a proclamation, often it doesn't get to the lowest levels, but even if it does, I don't think it's going to have the effect that they're hoping for. I think it is making a lot of people cynical. So.
Hi, Eric. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm curious, so your two sort of big themes on this were the younger generation is becoming more sort of ambitious and more independent, right? And I'm curious to what degree in the conversations that you've had, people are starting to reference the China dream, the Zhongguomeng. Like, is that actually something they're glomming onto, or is this something that you see as more sort of coming up from the ground level of the youth?
Yeah, you do hear that a lot. I think that is an appealing message. I mean, especially like for a political slogan, like it's heads and shoulders above like anything before, like Hu Jintao's harmonious society, like nothing really stuck. I think this does have more resonance, but I think the message that people are taking away from that is more like the idea of the American dream, like work hard, be ambitious, achieve your dreams. I don't think many people are latching on to the like sort of socialism with Chinese characteristics aspect and having the Chinese dream be part of the great rejuvenation. I think that is a little bit appealing in some context. I think this idea of China coming back and being a world power, I think that is very appealing among young people, that aspect of it. But I never really heard that when I talked about Chinese dream with young people, I never really heard that brought into it. I heard more of it seen as like, this is an individualistic, like my own personal ambition, which, yeah, I mean, that I think that is good with a lot of what the government wants to accomplish now with more innovation, entrepreneurship, but yeah, not really latching on to the sloganeering aspect of it and like the socialism with Chinese characteristics. Yeah, I think there's a bit different interpretation at the bottom than at the top. So, yeah, over here.
Eric, thanks for coming today. You talk a lot about education, and I was curious actually because I'm an undergraduate. I'm writing my thesis right now on Chinese nationals that are coming to American universities. Like in the years leading up, I think in this decade, kind of like to 2008, there were about 10,000 a year just overall, and now there's like 125,000. Like I just thought that was a crazy change. That's why I'm writing about it. And I was curious what your thoughts are on like why that is happening, like how significant that is, what that means, kind of if spending time in China with the youth gave you any insight into that.
It is actually my next big project I'm starting now, Chinese students in the U.S. It's actually the latest number I saw is like more than 300,000 Chinese students.
I should have said undergrad, sorry.
Okay, yeah, not sure what that number, but yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of different things flowing into that. I mean, although the economy is slowing, it is still growing by 6-7% a year. So every year people have more and more money. So I think there have always been a lot of students in China that wanted to study in the US, but every year more people are economically able to. So that's a big factor bringing people here. I think there is a growing appreciation of a Western style education. That was like, I did a couple chapters on education. And I mean, if you're familiar with the Gaokao college entrance exam in China, I mean, it's pretty brutal. I mean, for most students in China, it's a 2 to 3 day exam that determines everything, determines what college you can go to, if you can go to college, what you can major in. So, I mean, for most young people, that's their life up to that point in school is studying. So I think there is a lot of appreciation of how harmful that's been in a lot of ways. I think a lot of parents want their kids to get a more rounded Western style education. So I think as there's more of an appreciation of that, more people want to come. But people I'm talking to now, I mean, you name it, there's all kinds of reasons. Some people are frustrated with the way things are in China, want to use this as a step to get better educated, whatever they want to do. I talked to some journalists a couple months ago that really want to come out of China's atmosphere right now for journalists. So I think this too kind of speaks to the plurality, like the individualism burgeoning in Chinese society. Everybody I talk to has a different reason for wanting to come here. And now they're just increasingly getting the means to do so. So yeah, all sorts of things, I think. Yeah, back here.
The big impetus to British imperialism was the age of primogeniture, where only the eldest male could inherit. And so all of the younger sons went off to conquer India and so on. So it strikes me that this 50 million or 100 million males could be a huge source of energy for Xi Jinping's projects to maybe develop some kind of Silk Road colonialism. But an opposite kind of tendency could be that Chinese men would form families abroad and engage in like investment activities and then cycle these families back to China, so it would have an even more revolutionary impact. So my question really is, given that the Chinese rulers do take a long-run view and are looking at the power politics, presumably they're well aware of this, and well aware that there would be some kind of tipping point as to whether this demographic imbalance could be an engine for more Chinese colonialism, or it could be an engine for a reform that would devastate their monopoly of power. So are there any things that you can see that being aware of this, let's call it a tipping point, that they're trying to engineer how to use this demographic energy of rampaging young men?
Yeah. It's definitely a huge worry. I mean, you see this in official media even worry about the gender imbalance and the social instability it's going to cause. And I have read some more radical scenarios people have put forward. One is that like India has this problem also, so maybe someday there will be a war between the two countries to thin out the number of excess males, but that seems pretty far-fetched to me. But yeah, I mean, there is worries that this will make China more militaristic, that you will have sort of anxious guys, and there seems to be some overlap between like nationalistic outcry. And to do a quick aside, there was one guy I wrote about during the 2012 anti-Japan protests. There was this guy that had gotten involved, and a Toyota drove through, and this, I think he was a 20-year-old migrant worker, pulled out the Chinese driver of the car, beat him on the head with a bike lock, left him partially paralyzed. And he became one of the most wanted. He was put on TV, and this was like the poster child of nationalism getting out of control. And when reporters went back and looked at his family background, it was really interesting. He was like this really marginalized guy on the bottom fringes of society. And they looked back at his Weibo. He had written a couple things like, "Please God, grant me a wife." And he like escaped into video games, like violent video games, and just kind of felt disrespected all around and just atomized. And then when this protest started, it kind of sparked some life into him, and it gave him a chance to feel significant. So he got swept up in these protests, kind of became one of the main instigators, and then just, became violent at some point. So there's worries that something like that could happen, that like this sort of untamed nationalism, she might, or whoever succeeds she later on down the road, might try to harness this, co-opt the nationalism and use it for like military adventurism. I don't see that as a huge possibility. I think worried enough about social instability that something like that would risk even more. So I don't know if there's, and I would doubt a little bit the premise that Chinese leaders have the long view and that they're thinking 20, 30 years down the road about what they're going to do about this. I think a lot of leaders are very concerned on the here and now, especially like individual leaders worrying about what's going to happen under my leadership right now. So I don't know if there is a game plan to deal with this in the long run. But what you mentioned about like single guys going abroad, the problem with that is that the people that are most affected by this, by the gender imbalance, are the very lowest level economic, the men at the lowest end of the economic stratum. So it's your very poor rural guys. Unfortunately, economics does play a big role in marriage a lot of the time. So the very poorest men have the hardest time. So they're overwhelmingly what they call the bare branches, the single men. So I don't think you're going to solve much of this problem counting on them going abroad to invest, because there's kind of a mismatch in demographics with people that would be able to do something like that. So I don't know. To your bigger question about the long-term plans on that, your guess is as good as mine, probably. Sorry to ramble on, and probably not a very good answer.
So I think one of the more worrisome implications of your talk was that this tendency towards self-expression and protest is almost in some sense superficial, like it's a trend. It's trendy to be disagreeing with the government and so on. So as this millennial generation ages and becomes more tied down, they start families, do you think that the protests are going to die down and sort of disappear, or that the next younger generation is going to sort of take up their mantle and continue to be, I guess, subversive? Yeah.
So it does seem like the younger you get now, the more rebellious, more inclined to do things like this. So to field a guess, I would say it's more the latter, as like the post-80s, post-90s settled down. I think like the late post-90s, post-2000s in a couple of years, I think that they're looking to become even more rebellious because, again, they grew up even younger, exposed to all this information online. The next couple of years, you're going to have people turning 18, 19 that grew up like when they were 10, 11 on Weibo, like exposed to all these really critical things of the government at a very young age. So I think that trend looks likely to continue becoming more rebellious. But what you said is interesting about like protests, like that kind of thing being cool. I think that's very true to a large extent. A lot of the people that go to these things might not care intensely about it. I think that goes for all kinds of protests. In 2012, I went to the anti-Japan protests at the embassy, the Japanese embassy in Beijing, and I asked a lot of people, like, what are you doing here? And like the plurality answer was, I think it's cool. I don't know if I'll ever get to see a protest like this again. It wasn't so much I hate Japan with all my heart. It was like, oh, this is cool. And I think you see that in protests, I mean, of all kinds. Tiananmen, I mean, a lot of the people at a certain point it reached the threshold where you had enough people on the streets like, okay, it's safe to join, it's cool, I don't want to miss out on this. So then you have people just piling on. But I mean, that's interesting in and of itself because I think there could be a lot of overlap. People see things like the anti-Japan protest and see like, well, if they're that ardently nationalistic, are they really going to protest for something like Tiananmen? But like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of overlap in the demographics that would. And I think you have more and more people coming of age, grew up more economically secure, less afraid of stuff like that, more willing to go out on the streets if something like that were to happen. And we've actually seen that. We don't have to theorize about it. The last couple years, it's kind of tamped down since Xi tamped it down, but you did see this steady growth in popular movements, young people going out on the streets. And Xi is doing pretty well at tamping that down right now. He's very aggressively snuffing out anything that hints that it could become bigger. Whether or not that can last, at some point there could be like a leadership rift like there was in '89 that would allow people out in the streets. I don't know, but I think it would not surprise me if young people, I don't think there's anything in the young psyche that's really preventing that in the near future.
Can you talk a little bit about spirituality? We were talking about this before, and I was joking that people I knew in China who were 30-somethings, a lot of them, they're into Tibetan Buddhism, and then you hear about kind of younger Christians. I'm just wondering about religion and spirituality generally in that generation. And then, of course, when you talked about the 19th century, some of the rebellions that you mentioned had sort of interesting spiritual overtones to them. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. I did a chapter on Christianity, young people converting, a little bit on Buddhism, but I think that's really interesting in China right now because it's young people that are more religious than the old. People under 40, I think, make up, 65% was the stat. 65% of religious believers are under 40, which is really counter to the trend in like developed countries. Like in the US, it's the old people that are more religious. Religion is declining among young people. And it's really interesting, like looking at how that came about. Like that's the trend in a lot of like post-communist societies, where you have this spiritual vacuum. I mean, for so long in China, like Mao was the god, socialism was the ideology, but then markets broke that down, and a lot of people are looking for something to believe in. And it's really interesting with young people in China today, like I mentioned, the generation gap between the 25-year-old PLA instructor and the 18-year-olds. If you extrapolate that out to like young people and their parents, generation gulfs can just be incredible in China today. The mindset of parents who like grew up in the Cultural Revolution really struggling, and then kids that grow up today with as affluent as many cities have become. A lot of people I talked to that had like converted to Christianity, they said like nobody, like my parents don't understand me. I just can't have a meaningful conversation with them. But like when I went to this church, when I went to this house church, there were people that kind of accepted me unconditionally. We sang songs, and like I went to a couple of these little house churches with 20, 25 people, mostly like college kids. And they would just like be sitting there holding hands, crying, as like because they get this sense of family that they really didn't get at home because the generation gap is so huge. A couple other people I talked to, why they converted. One young woman, she had like a really nice family background, so she got along fine with her parents, but she said, like, when you have economic growth, you progress materially, you might find that that doesn't fill your empty heart. It sounded very like, I don't know, but it just like it spoke to how a lot of people really do like economic growth is not filling desires anymore and wanting more of a sense of meaning. And religion was one way people were finding that. Like I said, there are a lot of other ways like travel, activism, like things like that, where people want a higher sense of purpose, which I think is pretty natural anywhere. Like as far as Buddhism, Christianity, I kind of got the impression for a lot of people, like a lot of the Christians I talked to, I kind of got the impression that Christianity got to them first, and that's why they became Christian. If the Buddhists had got to them first, maybe they would have become Buddhists. Christianity does have kind of a extra appeal in that it's seen as more modern and Western, more trendy than a lot of native Chinese religions. But again, Buddhism is growing, I think, I don't know the exact numbers if anyone's done a reliable study, but Buddhism's up there. I mean, it's growing quite quickly too. I think there's a lot that appeals to that, to have something to believe in. So yeah, I think it was surprising at first, but the more I looked into it, it's quite natural. Like you look at other countries who've gone through something like this in a political vacuum, and I think it's pretty natural.
So I don't know how much you know about the role of like the contemporary art scene in China, but like it's been growing, especially in China and India. Just like the global arts market is becoming really huge, and I mean, art sort of has this like ethos of like self-expression and individuality. So I was wondering what you think the role of like these increasing art communities is in like affecting the younger generation.
I don't know a whole lot about that. To be honest, I haven't looked into artists that much. I've talked to a couple people that specialize in that, but in like, being more expressive. To generalize a bit further than like art like that, I remember I talked to, this is sort of related tangentially, but I talked to some comedians doing like stand-up comedy in China. And I think it might be a similar dynamic with art in that in the past, like comedy, like the big comedy thing is like crosstalk, xiangsheng, which there's like a form to it. And one of these comedians I talked to said that the art of crosstalk is like that there's a form and you do the form correctly. So somebody might compliment on you, not saying like you're funny, but like you have a good form in it. But like there's a couple people now really trying to spread stand-up comedy in China. They say this speaks to more individualism, and it's overwhelmingly young people in their 20s that like are interested in this, and that like every stand-up comedian has their own shtick, and it's about me standing on stage talking about different things, being individually funny. So it's kind of related to that. I don't know if it's really the same with art and making it more about the individual than about the established form, but I thought that was one kind of interesting form of artistic expression and how that's starting to shift a bit. Is it funny? I have seen a couple interesting, funny. Does it translate is a key question a lot of times. No, I don't think I've ever watched a crosstalk that I laughed at genuinely, but some of the stand-up people I've watched, it was pretty funny. I live in New York now, and there's a new comedy, Chinese language comedy scene, and some of them were pretty funny. Like anyone from China probably knows who Dashan is. This Canadian comedian. He's now doing stand-up comedy, becoming an evangelist for that, and he's doing very, very well with it, like getting incredible interest from schools. I watched a stand-up set he did. It is pretty funny. And yeah, I think a lot of it does translate. There are some things that are universal. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Cool. Could you talk about mental illnesses and if you've come across any staggering numbers, or if you have a hunch that in the near future with gender gap or individualism that there will be a rise in mental illnesses or proliferation and discussion about it?
Very good question, one that's way over my head. That is a bit of field from my focus, so I don't even want to try to field an answer to that, to be honest. I'm sorry. Very good question, though. It is, to do kind of tangentially, it does seem like there is sort of a more of appreciation for like psychological issues with younger people. I think there's more of an appreciation with that at a national level. I mean, I remember one thing that I came across in my research was like this trend for a long time, rural Chinese women killing themselves at a rate higher than just about anybody in the world, young women in particular. And I think after that, there was sort of an appreciation for issues going into this, and there has been some push on it. Suicide rate has come down among this demographic and in general in China. So again, this is way afield from my focus, but I think there is some improvement on that. But don't quote me on that. It's probably better next time you can find a mental health person. So.
Okay, great. Can you stick around if people have more
Yeah,
questions?
absolutely.
All right. Can you guys join me in thanking her? Thanks.
Thank you.